Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. Stu Clark here. This is my studio partner Otis. If you're new to the channel, I'm a professional wildlife photographer living here on Vancouver Island, and this channel is all about basically everything to do with wildlife photography. We're going to be looking at from camera setups, camera settings, gear I use. This won't be a review channel per se, but I'll definitely talk about some of the gear I use. And then we'll even get it right into Lightroom, Photoshop, and then we'll also touch on DaVinci Resolve for the video side of it. If that's of interest to you, please consider subscribing. Help this channel out and help me grow to keep bringing you interesting content on wildlife photography. So today's video, we're going to be looking at frame rates for video. This is one area where if you're new to videography, it can be quite daunting trying to figure out what settings you need to use when you're out in the field. If you're go on YouTube and you look at a lot of videos on how to take videos, you'll often see people mention how 24 frames per second is the preferred frame rate. It gives you a more cinematic look. And to be honest, I don't really notice it that much. For YouTube, they often talk about 30 frames per second being the more optimal video setting. But when it comes to wildlife, 24 and 30, as much as they're a real-time playback, they don't give you a lot of options for slowing things down. And that's where the 60 and 120 frames per second video recording formats really come into play. Over the last number of months, I've switched. I originally started out shooting H.265. If you watched any of my earlier videos on the Nikon Z8 setup, I was talking about shooting H.265. Over the last number of months, I switched over to shooting an N-raw because of the different options it gives you. It really gives you a lot more options, anywhere from 8K 60, 5.4K, which is a 1.5 crop at 60 frames per second, all the way down to the 3.8K, 2.3 crop, 120 frames per second. So you've got lots of different options that work really well for wildlife. The question is, when the heck do you use them? When does it make sense to switch from one to the other? So that's what today's video is going to be. And what we're going to do, we're going to jump on the computer. And I'm going to go through a bunch of different video clips, and we'll talk about why I chose to shoot them at the frame rates I did. And hopefully this will give you a lot better understanding. So when you head out in the field, if you're going to be shooting birds or elk, bears, things like that, you've got a little bit more of an understanding of what video settings you want to start the day off at. Okay, right on, let's get into it. It can be the starting point that we're going to look at first. So 4K 30, depending on your camera, with the Nikon Z8, 4K is full frame, which is fantastic. 4K 30 has got some real benefits in certain categories. And the first off is going to be when you're recording audio and you want to have playback with real time. So if you've got birds singing, so this marsh wren is a great example of that. We're looking at this marsh wren. 4K 30 is beautiful. You drop on a 30 frames per second timeline, it plays back real time, looks great, sounds great. You could also just put this 30 frames per second right onto a 24 frames per second timeline, even though it's a little bit smaller. There'll be 6 frames dropped every second. It'll still look great. You won't really notice it. At least I don't. Your mileage may differ on that, but for the most part, you won't really notice it. Like I said, so this playback you're looking at here is 30 frames per second video that's just been placed straight onto the timeline, and then DaVinci Resolve is basically just dropping some of the frames out of the equation. So this would be great if you're going out to take video of warblers. Anytime you're going to be recording audio and you want the playback to be in real time, that's where the 30 frames per second is a good option. The 4K 30 is a great way if you're just getting started and you want to go out and throw a shotgun mic on your camera and record some birds singing. The 4K 30 is an excellent starting point for sure. The other really nice thing with the 4K 30, because it's full frame and it's 30 frames per second, when you're using the shutter angle rule of 180 degrees, you want to shoot your 30 frame per second video at 1/60th of a second shutter speed. Well, that 1/60th is quite a slow shutter speed. So this is a great setting, again, because it's full frame, 1/60th of a second. It's an amazing setting when you're dealing with low light shooting situations. This elk is a perfect example of that. This would be kind of, sunset at this point. We're kind of well beyond the photography side of catching this. These would have been 6400 ISO, 8000 ISO shots, and at the distance would have been well past the point of where you're actually going to take photos, but switching to video, because you're dealing with a much slower shutter speed than you can capture the photo at, you're going to be able to get the ISO a lot lower. So yeah, so that's kind of the quick one. So like I say, 4K 30, it's about real-time audio, and it's also about shooting in really low light. They're going to be the main times I would actually pick 4K 30. It's funny because I said it's going to be the one you start out with most likely, but it actually turns out it's the one I use the least. And so that's where we'll the next one is going to be the 4K 60. Let's take a look at that. So the 4K 60, again, still full frame. We're now dealing with 60 frames per second instead of 30 frames per second. Where I like the 60 frames per second is that if you look at this marsh wren here, when you're playing back, so this is 60 frames per second that's just been placed onto the 24 frames per second timeline. There's nothing has been changed other than just putting it on there, and the DaVinci Resolve will drop frame rates. With 60 frames per second put onto a 24 frames per second timeline, it's dropping every frame and a half, basically. I find that the playback still is quite smooth. When we're looking at it, the 24 frames per second playback at real time, and now this is when it's been slowed down a little bit, so the audio won't sync properly. So this is why with the recording of sound is not great. But this will basically slow this footage down 1.5 times. So it just gives you a little bit, extends the clip. So you've got a very short clip of a bird. This will help to extend it a little bit. Like I said, you wouldn't necessarily use it in this situation where it's singing, but it does help to stretch that clip out a little bit longer. So with this Swainson's thrush here, again with the 60p, it's great because you can just play this at real time, no problem, but it does give you that option to slow things down a little bit. And when if you shot at 30 or 24, you lose that option of, if the bird was to stretch or do anything dynamic, you kind of lose that potential there. So this is the 60 slowed down to 24. So you can see it slows everything down. What's really nice is that if you're hand holding 60 versus 30, one of the big issues with 30 frames per second, if you're hand holding it, every little bit of movement is very obvious. Even with vibration reduction, even if you use stabilization in DaVinci Resolve, it can be tough to sometimes stabilize that footage. But when you slow it down, that's one of the beautiful things with by slowing down the frame rate a little bit, it will actually smooth out a little bit of the vibration. Even the smaller jitters get really smoothed out when you drop the frame rate and you slow it down a little bit. So here's a good example too. So this heron, again, this is 60 frames per second, just put onto the 24 frame per second timeline. This is at real time. And you can see just how the water's rolling in. It's all real time. It looks decent, so there's no issues putting the 60 onto a slower timeline, which is great. But if I slow this down, so you look at the water here, this is at real time. And then we jump to the next clip here. You can see how the waves are slowed right down. It's because you're dropping the frame rate by half. It looks great in playback, in slow motion. The wind rippling on the feathers still looks natural, but it'll basically extend the clip out so you've got more usable footage. So if you've got a short duration encounter, it'll basically double the time of that encounter. So you see a bird lands for 3 seconds, all of a sudden becomes 6 seconds or 8 seconds footage on the 24 frame per second timeline. It just adds more footage for you so you can work with it without looking like it's in full slow motion. So it's a really nice, the 60p is a really useful frame rate. So this one, I'll give you an example. So this is a good one to demonstrate how it helps with the vibration a little bit. So this, you can see this is handheld. I was laying in an uncomfortable position, so there's quite a bit of movement here. But watch what happens. You can see how much bouncing around we have going on here with the footage. Watch what happens when I drop this to 24 frames per second. So this is at real time. You can see there's quite a bit of movement in the camera. It's not going to get rid of the movement. So you can see how the motion of the camera is slowed down. It's not as quick, and it just helps a lot. So now if you do stabilization on this footage, it looks great. It'll really kind of cut out most of that movement, at least from quick movement. So that's a great trick. With shooting 60, you drop to 30 or 24 in this case, and just that drop of frame rate will really smooth out the quick movements if you're hand holding the footage. Okay, so yeah, and again, the 4K being full frame, another one, even with the 4K 60, it's a great one for using in lower light situations where you still need that potential slow motion. Okay, so we take a look at this elk walking towards the camera here. So again, it's a low light situation, so you wouldn't want to be going to the crop modes. But this just kind of adds some dramatic effect as he's walking towards the camera here. And like I say, it doesn't really look like it's in slow motion. It looks fairly natural, even with the breathing and everything else. But it just kind of adds a little bit of dramatic effect to the footage. I like 60 for wildlife, and I definitely find the 120 works for in the bird world a lot better. Wildlife generally, the 60 works is nice where it slows it down enough most situations where the 120 will be over slow. This guy walking at 120 frames per second, slowed down to 24 frames per second, would be a 5 times slow motion, and that's just too much. It's really slow, and it just doesn't really work. But the 1.5 times going from 60 to or sorry 2.5 times going from 60 to 24 works really well. And then this camera with the 4K, it also has 120 in the N-raw, and the 120 in the N-raw is fantastic. You're dealing with full frame. It's one of the few cameras on the market that'll do 120 frames per second without a crop mode, and it's an amazing feature because you're getting the benefits of the full frame, but you're getting the high frame rate, so you can really slow that down. So with 120 frames per second video, when you drop it onto a 30 frames per second timeline and you do clip attributes and you change it to 30 frames per second, you're basically doing a 4 times slow motion. When you put it on a 24 frames per second timeline like this, it's a 5 times slow motion. So it can get a bit confusing. Some cameras do slow motion in camera and it'll be 5 times or 4 times. That's basically what we're doing here by shooting the faster frame rate and then slowing it down in DaVinci Resolve. We're just doing it in reverse basically. And so just recording high frame rate and you slow it down. And that's kind of a nice way of doing it. What's nice about doing it this way is that you've got options of how you want to use it. If you record it in slow motion, it slows at a 5 times slow motion. It's more difficult to do anything other than slow motion. You're basically stuck with that footage. So with recording it this way, you can slow it down, and that works super well. So you can see with this deer, you can see even at 120 frames per second, if you have good light, there's very low noise because there's no crop factor. So that's why I said this is an amazing setting where you might encounter some action. The flip side of it though, the 120 does not play back well at real time if there's a lot of action. So the 120 frames per second is fine. If there's no motion, you can definitely play it back at real time. But if you've got any sort of motion at all, you will see the frames that have been dropped, and you will get a jitteriness to it. It's less than ideal. So this is definitely a frame rate you're going to use when you're trying to freeze action. This adorable little fawn walking here. I wasn't sure if he was going to bound away, so that's why I was shooting the 120, but it still really works, even though he's walking slow. And I was hand holding this, so there's quite a bit of movement in the camera itself. So by slowing it down 5 times, it still makes for really great footage, and it really smooths everything out really nicely. So this is similar to that heron footage we saw. We're at the 124. So instead of just being slowed down 2.5 times, we're slowed down 5 times. You wouldn't probably shoot this heron at this frame rate unless you're expecting it to catch a fish. And that's why I had this rolling at this frame rate. I was hoping for it to catch a fish, and that's where that 5 times slow motion, slowing it down, works wonderfully. It looks amazing. Like I said, that 5 times. So if I put this on a 30 frames per second timeline, that would only be a 4 times slow motion. So putting it on the 24 is a 5 times. That I think it just adds a little bit extra. But you can see with the background just how clean the 4K is. And that's, like I said, this camera shoots beautiful 4K video at any of the frame rates. So you can see the feathers blowing in the wind. Again, everything just looks, gives it that cinematic effect when you've slowed it down. And when you look at this next clip here, you can see just how beautiful it is when it's slowed down. You can just see the wispiness of the feathers and everything else. So for me, the 120 frames per second for a bird video, as long as there's no calls involved, like I said, you really need to have, because you're dealing with slow motion. When you slow this footage down, the audio is not slowed down. So the audio will basically only cover the first fifth of the clip because you're slowing it down 5 times, or the first quarter of the clip if you're slowing it down 4 times. So that's something to be aware of. So a lot of times, so I'll plug my shotgun into the Rode Wireless, and this allows me to get record separately from the camera. So I'll record ambient in through the camera, but then have a separate mic to record the other sounds around, so that I've got full playback where I can play it a longer duration. I'll keep recording throughout the shoot, so that I can kind of overlay that audio as needed. Even though you've only recorded audio for a short portion of the video clip, generally you're not going to play back the entire full-length slow motion clip. So a lot of times you have enough audio for the clip you're going to put in on the timeline anyway. So that's another thing to keep in mind. You can just kind of move the audio around to cover the clip as you need it. In weather events like this where it's raining, again, you can see how nice it is with that slow motion. You can really kind of adds dramatic effect of the rain falling and everything else, the rain hitting the water. So that slow motion, there's a lot of benefit to having recorded in slow motion. And finally is dealing with things like ospreys. And this is where this type of footage is a ton of fun, where again, it's at slowing it down 5 times. So this is 120 frames per second, slowed down to 24. And it allows you to capture, the ospreys diving. Said the downside of this footage, it doesn't play well at full speed. So we'll show you when we get to some of the other frame rates here. We'll give a demonstration of that. But if you are shooting 120 frames per second in this sort of situation, it does have to be slowed down. So something to keep in mind. And then finally the C line here. And this is again a situation where low light, so the full frame was really needed. You wouldn't want to use a crop mode in this situation. 120 frames per second speaks for itself in that sort of situation where that clip, even at 120 frames per second, is only 2 or 3 seconds. So had that been at real time, it's a second. It's a 1 second clip, and it's not long enough to even really see it. And you drop it on the timeline, it's just a bang bang, and it's gone. So the slow motion, being able to kind of stretch that out over 3, 4, 5 seconds, really adds to the dramatic effect of the clip and makes it a lot more worthwhile to add to your timeline. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the 5.4K. So the 5.4K is one I actually use a lot. And so this is a 1.5 times crop. So this is basically a DX video camera at this point, as opposed to a full frame video camera when you're shooting the 5.4K. 5.4K at 30 frames per second. I rarely use this one. It is nice though for recording those birds. You need a little bit of a crop factor. It is useful there real time, and it's also nice in those low light situations where you need the crop factor. It'll definitely help you crop in on it, and the calls are at real time. And this one again was shot almost dark. This was really low light situation here, so you definitely see a lot more noise. But that 5.4K, and again, because we're shooting at 1/60th, that helps a lot. With this one, I had the teleconverter on and the crop factor. They were fairly distant for this shot. So this was shot at 700 mil with the teleconverter, and then a 1.5 crop on that, which would be what's at over 1,000 mils. These elk are another example where, and again, lower light. Said the 5.4K in this situation, fence line, I couldn't get any closer. So that 1.5 crop at 30p, just a great choice in this sort of situation. The 5.4K 60 is one I use a lot, and this one is is a great option for singing birds. The 60p again, like we said, it plays back great at real time, and it looks amazing. I know a lot of people say, well, you bought a full frame camera. Why are you shooting in a crop mode? Because I don't have the 800 6.3 PF lens. That's the short answer. If you had an unlimited budget, you would go out and you'd buy the 600 f4 and the 800 6.3, and you'd have all the different lenses, and then you would just shoot everything in full frame. And if you've got that in your budget, all the power to you. But for me, it's kind of maximizing not only budget, but also how much gear can you carry in the field. I really like using the 200 to 500, as much as it's not some people might not consider it a pro lens. The photo quality, image quality of it are excellent. And I find that from the versatility of the zoom in so many situations, it just works for me. Give you an idea here. So this is the 5.4K 60 when it's slowed down a little bit. And this is what's really nice. I say that 60p slowed down. For me, I think it works so well. It just extends the footage a little bit without looking like you've slowed it down. This eagle's I heard a big splash on the other side of the river. I was looking for sea lions. And then all of a sudden I saw him crawl out of the river with the salmon in his talons. And this one's here is a perfect example where this one's slowed down, but the footage looks great. It doesn't look like it's slow motion, but it just adds a little bit of, I said you can extend the footage out as needed. It looks super clean still. And I say this was quite low light, so you can see even in lower light situations, the crop, this was shot across the river. It's actually quite a bit distance between me and the bird here. And that 1.5 crop really helps just to get tighter on your subject. And then, yeah, it looks great. And this is the 5.4K with the teleconverter. So he said, so with the 5.4K, you can utilize the teleconverter as well. And this one's giving me, like I say, this will be over 1,000 millimeters in this footage here. And I say that 2.5 times slow motion, I think really works for wildlife. And it doesn't look, it doesn't look slow motion. I think it looks really nice and works super well. Especially if you drop some music in the background, you have some, the gulls calling in the ambience of the scene playing in the background, it works really well. Again, this is slowed down. You could play this back at real time, no problem. But this is nice. It gives you a good example of just how clean the 5.4K is. There's no noise, and you're not looking at this and saying, "Oh, that's a crop camera. It's terrible." Kind of utilizing that 1.5 crop, it still looks excellent. It's going to look great on a 50-inch TV as well. So I think a lot of times people get so hung up on is it full frame or crop, even the micro four thirds. And we'll talk about that because with the 2.3 times crop, you're effectively getting into micro four thirds territory. And if the light is good, the footage looks great. So there's no reason to not shoot that. In this situation, because if you're shooting in 4K 30 or 4K 60, you don't want to crop in on that footage because you're basically losing pixels at that point. With the 8K 30 or 8K 60, you can crop into this 5.4K no problem. And that's one of the things when you're shooting. If you shot in 8K all the time, you can crop. It does give you some options. We're just dealing with the file sizes, so that's one reason I don't generally shoot with it. But depending on if you've got, just lots of disposable ink for hard drives, all the power to you. You can definitely, that 8K 30 or 8K 60 is really useful because you can just crop in after the fact. But I'm trying to maximize file size and footage quality, so I find just using the info button and switching between all these different raw settings works really well for me. See, especially when you're shooting warblers, songbirds, this is where the 5.4 is great, getting the crop, but also the duration of the footage is often so short. So if you just shot in 30 frames per second all the time, you would only have 2-second clips most of the time. Bird stops, sings, gone. And you have very little footage to actually put together on your timeline. When you drop it in, when you use that 60 frames per second, you can slow it down a little bit. You can play it at real time. You get the bird singing, looks awesome. But then you can drop it down, slow it down a little bit, and then you can utilize it a little bit better on your timeline. Especially the sections where they're not singing. So this is another one where handheld footage, once I've got it stabilized a little bit here. But this is one where at 30 frames per second at real time, he's just chomping away really quick. And this one just, like I say, I think it adds so much to the shot, and it doesn't look slow motion. So that's where that 60 is so nice. Just slow it down a little bit, adds the footage. You can actually see what's going on. You can see the features. You can see his eyes better. You see the whiskers. Everything's just added just by having it a little bit slower. You can just see so much more of what's going on, as opposed to him just chomping away really quick. And when you look at the real time footage here, you see how quick it is. It's just not nearly as appealing. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. Just like I say, slow it down a little bit, looks great. And again, even when you don't have a lot of movement, that slow motion, just the breath coming off these elk here, the insects and the dust flying around in the footage, just adds a whole lot of dramatic flair to the shot. That I think having some 60 frames per second footage in your timeline that's slowed down just really adds to the whole the movie that you're making, or the video you're putting together. And this is why a good example of why I chose to shoot in 60 in this situation. There was bull sparring, and you didn't know when it was going to happen. So by shooting in 60, you're prepared where you've got some slow motion. If you shot everything with 30, when action starts to happen, you haven't got the option to slow it down. So shooting in 60, like I said, you can shoot it real time, no problem. But then you can drop it on the time. You can slow it down as well. And this is works really well here. And now we have the 3.8K 20. So the 3.8K, it says 2.3 crop, but I've read that it's actually only a 2.1. But anyway, 2.3 crop at 120 frames per second. This one is fantastic for birds in flight. When I go out to the estuary, this is going to be my video setting of choice, where I'm going to have very brief encounters with fast flying birds, a peregrine flying over, Cooper's hawk flying over, ospreys diving, that sort of situation. Birds singing, but again, the playback of the audio is not going to work, but it is an excellent setting when you're not worried about audio. 3.8K 120, it's beautiful as long as you got the light, because this is basically you're cropping into a micro 4/3 portion of the sensor, so you're cropped right in. So with my 500 mil lens, I'm over 1,000 mil with this setting, so it's fantastic if you got a small fast subject, you got brief encounters. For that sort of situation, it's amazing as long as you got the light. It has to be a fairly bright day. The noise will definitely start to show once you hit kind of 2500 ISO or higher. You definitely start to see the noise with this setting, and this would not be the optimal setting as the light gets lower. This setting is available in the H.265. It's not available in the ProRes, so if you are shooting the H.265, you do have access to this video setting. And this was actually shot with H.265. So this is a good example where I've used it for the crop factor more so than the slow motion. This little saw-whet, he was quite a bit of distance, and he was tucked into the cedar, so there's no, all of his body is basically kind of covered. But you can see how much noise shows on him, because this is very low light in a situation that was not ideal for the 2.3 crop. So this is that same eagle shot across the river. And this is where, by taking advantage of the 2.3 crop, I didn't need the teleconverter. So without using the teleconverter, this shot's going to be a little bit sharper, a little bit crisper. And the noise is probably a trade-off by being extra ISO with the teleconverter versus no teleconverter, and being able to be a little bit lower ISO. So it's a bit of a trade-off here. And then this would be teleconverter with the 2.3 crop. So with this footage here, to give you an example, say this is quite a good distance here, but this is effectively 1600 millimeters. So that's a trick if you, like I say, if you just you've got an obstacle, you just can't get closer. Obviously some more noise in this shot, but if you just, you've got that, you just want to get a little tighter, the TC with the crop factor can definitely work. So now we're going to talk about one of the huge advantages to that 2.3 crop. And this is one of actually the Micro Four Thirds are renowned for this, is their macro capability. So utilizing my 500mm lens with the 2.3 crop, we're basically looking at 1150 millimeters, basically a minimum focus distance of 7.2 feet. So this lens has got a 0.22 times magnification ratio. 0.22 times 2.3, we're looking at 0.5. So basically looking at half of one-to-one macro. It's about half the magnification of a full macro lens at 7 feet. That's where this 2.3 crop at 120 frames per second gets really interesting. If you like to do any sort of dragonfly, videography, bugs, flowers, anything like that, it's really, really useful, and it's a really interesting video setting. So you can see that this hoverfly here, just the 120 frames per second, so that 5 times slow motion is great. 240 might be a little bit nicer for insects, but it still works really, really well. But you can, you're filming this from 7 feet away, and you can see just how fantastic it is. It works amazing, really sharp, really clear, really interesting footage. That would be difficult to get if you had a one-to-one macro lens. You'd just be right on top of your subject, and it would be a lot more difficult to capture this. And this where the N-raw, the color is fantastic. It works. It's just really nice. And this is, like I say, this is one of those features that I never see being talked about. It's always about, most of the time people are talking about the Z8, it's all about 8K. 8K RAW, 8K video, 8K video. And 8K video, like I said, we'll talk about that next. It has its place, but I think some of these other settings are, from a wildlife photography standpoint, really beneficial. And this is having this sort of footage really adds to the B-roll. You're putting together a wildlife video, having B-roll of the flowers and the insects and bees and flies in the area just really add to the whole depth of your video. And so it's having this sort of B-roll is just great without having to switch lens. I'm walking along taking photographs of birds, videoing birds, and I can quickly just switch to that 2.3 crop, and I'm right in. Like I said, it's half. It's not one-to-one macro. It's half-to-one macro, which works awesome. One-to-one, in some cases, actually be too tight. This kind of, you can still get the flower and the color and everything else, but you're close enough to your subject to really kind of to make it look awesome. You can actually see the compound eyes on these flies. For me, I'll call that a win. I don't need to be right and tight with the macro. If you did have a macro with the 2.3 crop, you'd be looking at 2-to-1. So you'd be twice life size. So that would definitely be look great as well. This is where this 3.8K shines. 120 frames per second with the crop. So this osprey was feeding on flounders at quite a distance. He was quite a bit offshore. So being able to use that crop factor, they generally will catch the fish and they fly in quite low until they get closer to the shore and they lift up to go to the trees. So this was where, by having that crop factor, I'm at eye level when he's 100 meters offshore, and the camera kind of can track him really nicely. The footage looks fantastic. This footage really speaks for itself, both for the clarity, the sharpness. Gives you a great idea of the autofocus of the Nikon Z8 with the 200 to 500, which is considered by most people too slow. The autofocus is too slow to work. Well, this gives you a good idea of how the autofocus can actually perform. That osprey kind of flew right at me, and even in video mode, this camera does an amazing job of tracking. Okay, this is kind of the real time. This gives you an example of just how quickly the motion's going on here. what we're trying to track. But you'll notice how this is the problem when you're shooting with the 120. I said it only works for slow motion. So you can see how the wing beats are almost missed. Basically, it misses wing beats. So basically, it goes from one wing position to the next because you've dropped frame rates. The frame rates have been eliminated. So that's where, like I said, it works fine on a slow where there's no movement. You can slow it down. That's okay there. But when you're dealing with any sort of fast action, you will have to slow it down. You realize just how quick the motions are and how quick the sequences. That each of these video clips is insanely short duration. That bird, it hovers, but then it's flying down and gone. And so having that 5 times longer footage with the 120 is just so useful. The heron's flying by, really makes a difference having that extra footage. Like I said, just stretches everything out. Again, let's have a look at that clip there. So that's 6057. Let's just drop that on. So he said, you can see how long that, this flyby footage is. You can see the feathers rippling. You can see the eye. Everything's just, you can, as the viewer of the video, you see so much of the heron. But when you get to the real-time clip here, just to give you an idea, this is what you're seeing from a real-time clip. There's virtually nothing there. It's such a short time span. And this example where you can take advantage of the crop. This is slowed right down. If you played it back at real time, nothing would really change. There's so little movement in the footage. It'd be totally fine playing this back at real time, but even slow motion, there's not much happening. So it's a really nice serene clip of the herd sitting down that no one would notice whether it was slow motion or not. But you gain that crop factor. But yeah, this kingfisher footage here gives you a really good example of just how useful the 120 is. Looks fantastic. And finally, the 8K. So 8K, for me, I rarely use it. The file size, the slowdown on the computer don't make a ton of sense for me in a lot of situations. By utilizing the eye menu where I can quickly switch between frame sizes and frame rates, I find I don't really need it. But where the 8K with this camera is the best video quality, no question. Where will you see it? That's debatable. Do you need an 80-inch TV to really see it? It probably. On a computer monitor, you're really splitting hairs to tell the difference between 4K and 8K. 8K does give you the flexibility that you can crop it after. Because you've got 8K, you've got 8,000 pixels on the long side. You can crop it twice, zoom right in on your footage in DaVinci Resolve and still have 4K footage. So basically all the crop options you have in camera, you can do after the fact. That is definitely one of the beautiful things with shooting the 8K is that you're just recording at one frame size and then you can do it all after the fact as opposed to in camera. And that's something to definitely consider. If you've got tons of hard drive space and you want to get the best quality possible, all the power to you. The 8K 30 would be an excellent choice for recording real-time birdsong, and then the 8K 60 would be fantastic for any sort of wildlife type shooting. 8K, so we're looking at the 8K 30 here. Except the image quality is fantastic. You're definitely going to have, the best dynamic range. Everything is going to be the best in the AK30. This is a kind of a great example where AK30 would be perfect. Animalscapes, where you've got, a herd of elk, you got a mountain view with a bear. That's the sort of situation where that's where AK30, where you've got a subject that's not really moving that much. You've got a scene that also you want to capture. Absolutely shoot at AK30 for the highest quality possible. And that would be a situation where, yep, there's definitely some benefit to that. Same again, not a lot of movement in this guy here. And the AK30 definitely works for this sort of scenario. Got the mist coming, the sun coming through the mist. Again, yep, shoot AK30. You had a grizzly bear in the distance for sure. AK30 makes sense. It looks great. Depending on your computer, you might definitely have some playback issues with it. I find my computers generally plays okay with the AK30. And this is in normal mode. All the RAW is in normal mode versus high quality. It's about half the bit rate. And that really helps for both the file size and the playback. And then finally, the 8K60. So the 8K60, this one I think does definitely have some value because you've got the slow motion factor to it. You've got that 8K, so you can zoom in. You've got lots of cropping options. The big downside with the 8K60 is playback. You will most likely need to build proxy files in DaVinci Resolve to use 8K60 unless you're dealing with a 4090 NVIDIA video card, top of the line computer system all around. Then you'll probably be okay with the 8K60. For mine, like I said, it's definitely a high-end computer, but it does struggle with the 8K60, so I don't really use it that much. And because I can do it in camera with the 5.4K 60 or the 4K 60, for most situations, I get most of the quality I need using the crop modes in camera. Yeah, so I think the 8K gives you the most versatility in editing as long as you've got the frame rates 30 or 60 is fast enough for the slow motion footage you want to shoot. Or if you're shooting in real time, the 8K30 is wonderful, no question. You got lots of cropping options, things like that, highest quality. It just comes down to file size at that point. And with wildlife and birds, I'm almost always want to be in the 60 frames per second range or higher. That I find that I said the 8K60 looks great, but the files get huge really quickly. So for me, it's kind of it's nice to have, but I've got a 50-inch TV that at the 4K can't really take advantage of the 8K other than the cropping, and because you can just do that in camera, I just find that utilizing the in camera settings are just make sense for me. Getting low with that 8K full frame is makes for some pretty amazing footage. Well, that's frame rates in a nutshell. I thought it was going to be a 10-minute video. Apparently not. I hopefully didn't ramble on too long. Hopefully you got some good information out of this and gives you a much better idea of how frame rates get utilized and how you can utilize the frame rates if you're shooting with a Nikon Z8 or even if you're shooting with Sony or Canon, even the Micro Four Thirds, the different frame rates. Hopefully this video will give you some good idea of how you can utilize those frame rates in different situations. And just to reiterate, so this was all done on a 24 frames per second. So I'm being shot at 24 frames per second right now, 24 frames per second timeline on DaVinci Resolve. And then these video clips were put on where they've just been dragged on for real time, or using clip attributes where I was changing the frame rate and then putting it onto the timeline at 23.97 frames per second, 24 frames per second. And that's then we'll stretch it out, and that just stretches the frames out as opposed to removing frames when you put it on at real time. So yeah, that's like I said, It gives you an idea of how I utilize different frame rates for videos for wildlife. Hope you got some great info out of this. If you did, please like and subscribe. Until next time, we'll see you out there. Take care.